Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, David Lucy Mabel. And today, folks, we are going to be talking about what defines a muscle car. All right, so the other day, to preface this, I did something that I typically don't do, mostly because I'm lazy. But I follow a bunch of car groups on Facebook. I'm part of a bunch of car groups on Facebook. And one of them is called Unpopular Car Opinions. Now, I know you all may have heard of this in some previous podcasts that I have done about unpopular car opinions and about some of the things that I've seen. But I decided to post something myself. Post a sort of other opinion that I had that was unpopular. So I posted it, and I had said that there was only American cars should be referred to as muscle cars. There is no such thing as, quote, an Italian muscle car. But I was not just, griping with the Italians. I was griping with any other country that was not America, producing something that they claimed was a muscle car. And if you really look at it, they never claim that their cars are muscle cars. But other people who are perhaps uneducated, I don't mean to sound pretentious, but who just are uneducated about car history and car body styles and whatnot, might say that, oh, well, this car was built in Germany, but it's a muscle car. No, muscle cars are purely American. And you will soon find out why. Now, I'll tell you some of the comments that I got, and I'll tell you my personal definition of what a muscle car is in the last segment. And you'll have to stay tuned to hear some of the other things that people said. But here's what I did my research on, and this is what my research concluded. According to Wikipedia, now I know, a lot of people say that, Wikipedia is not a source, it's just good for information, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is not a scholarly article, this is a car podcast. So for me, Wikipedia is going to work just fine. But Wikipedia says a muscle car is a term for a high-performance American coupe, usually but not limited to rear-wheel drive with a high-displacement V8 placed up front. All right. So by that definition, your Corvette could be considered a muscle car. Is a Corvette considered a muscle car? To some people, it's more of a sports car. I would say it's more of a sports car. So there's some wiggle room in that definition. But you see, my point is brought up that it is an American car. A car from abroad cannot be considered a muscle car because it is not an American car. Each country that produces cars has their own car culture. Their cars have their own characteristics. As you've seen, I've done podcasts on Korean cars. I've done podcasts on German cars. I've done podcasts on Italian cars. I've mentioned French cars in there. I have mentioned Japanese cars several times. I've mentioned American cars, obviously. You see, each one of those places that produces a car has their own philosophy on producing a car. And all I was trying to say is that the American philosophy of the muscle car is not something that is replicated anywhere else. It is a purely American sort of thing. Merriam-Webster says any of a group of American-made two-door sports coupes with powerful engines designed for high-performance driving. That is what defines a muscle car by the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Now, the first use of the term muscle car was in 1966. But that doesn't mean that the idea of a muscle car didn't exist before that. That was just the first time someone had called it a muscle car. Now, I must make a distinction between muscle cars and pony cars. Muscle cars were larger and focused mainly on straight line speed, much heavier cars with much worse handling. And pony cars, however, were smaller and offer more agile handling, although they have less power. The pony cars came after the muscle cars. The first pony car was the Mustang that came out in 1964. However, the idea of a muscle car had existed way before that. In fact, they're saying that the first muscle car could have appeared as early as the 1940s. Of course, you'll find that out in the next segments because we'll be discussing that later on. Here's some examples of pony cars versus muscle cars. These categories tend to be blurred, but this is a sort of example that I'm trying to give as far as what I mean, what a pony car is versus a muscle car. Okay. Ford Mustang is a pony car. Ford Galaxy 500 is a muscle car. Chevy Camaro is a pony car. Chevy Impala SS is a muscle car, granted the two-door coupe version. A Plymouth Barracuda is a pony car. A Plymouth Roadrunner is a muscle car. A Pontiac Firebird is a pony car, but a Pontiac GTO is a muscle car. Now, if you notice that all of these ones in the muscle car column have all been basically built on full-size, if not full-size, mid-size car platforms that were transformed when a larger engine was shoehorned into them, and they were tuned to make the most amount of power and the most amount of speed in a straight line scenario, such as drag racing. Drag racing really brought upon the golden age of the muscle car, if you will, that you will soon find out in segment 3 when I discuss the brief history of muscle cars. Pony cars, on the other hand, as you can tell, did not always have V8s, were not always necessarily powerful, but they were built more for agility. And the fact that all of them were two-door coupes, they had long hoods and short rear decks. And that's how they were designed. Muscle cars, not so much the same way. Ford Galaxy 500 was a coupe, but they had a sedan version as well. Chevy Impala SS coupe had a sedan version. I'm not sure if there was a sedan version of the Plymouth Roadrunner, but it was built on a full-size platform. Pontiac GTO was a Grand Tempest option. That's what it means. That was a trim level of the Pontiac Tempest Le Mans. So it's like what are you trying to say here? What I'm trying to say is that any other country out there hasn't replicated the idea of a muscle car. I mean, I've heard concessions being made to German cars. Oh, well, the AMG cars are muscle cars. They have lots of power. No, they're not. European cars are much too refined to be considered muscle cars. And it's not an insult to any other place. It's not an insult to America, really. It's just the fact is, muscle cars are big, loud, and brawny. Your AMG car might have a lot of power, but your AMG car is tuned for handling. It's a sports car. It's luxurious on the inside. Not all of them are large with large displacement engines. Some of them have smaller displacement engines relative to the size of the car that they have been put into. It's not like you're going to be finding an S-Class, like a coupe S-Class with... It's not going to happen. They are too refined. The Germans make their car in such a way that if they're going to make a sports car, not only is it going to handle well, it's going to have good power. The sports cars, the muscle cars here in America were not that refined. Essentially, they took a large car, put an even larger engine into it, and it was rear-wheel drive and a two-door coupe, and that's what it was. It was not concerned with matters of handling. It was not concerned with matters of engineering. It's really the philosophy that goes into designing and eventually manufacturing and eventually selling the car. The whole philosophy behind that process. That's what makes a muscle car. It's a question of intent. It's a question of intent. Like, I studied philosophy when I was in undergrad. And I will tell you, the philosophy behind the American muscle car is not the same philosophy behind the German AMG car or the BMW M car or the Audi S series. It's not the same sort of philosophy. It's a question of intent, like I said just a few seconds ago. If their intention was to make a muscle car, then there are certain things that they would have to follow that muscle cars are considered. First off, they are an American sort of idea. I'm not saying this because I'm obnoxiously patriotic. I'm saying it as a matter of history. It's American. Just like Cadillac is American, so is the muscle car. Just like apple pie is not American. It came from the Dutch. But just like hamburgers are purely American, the muscle car is purely American. Just like barbecuing is American. You know, these are sorts of things that are American sort of ideals that history has shown us came from Americans with American ideas in the country of the United States of America. It's a question of history. If the Germans' intent was to create a muscle car, there are certain things that they would have to follow. Full-size car, two-door coupe, large engine, unrefined, not made for performance around corners, not made for handling, made for drag racing. That's a muscle car. And by that definition, I would say up until recently, Mustangs weren't muscle cars. Mustangs have always been pony cars. Nowadays, the lines have been blurred, so I can understand why someone would say a pony car like a Mustang is also a muscle car. So I will say some pony cars are muscle cars, but not all muscle cars are pony cars. So it's not necessarily because it's a pony car, it's a muscle car, or because it's a muscle car, it's a pony car. It's a Venn diagram. There's a circle that has muscle cars on one side. There's a circle that has pony cars on another side. And then the area that they overlap in the middle would be the pony cars that are also muscle cars, which the modern Mustangs would fit that sort of category. Now, here's the deal that I have, is that a lot of people think just because a car is a sports car or just because it's powerful, that means it's a muscle car. This is not so. This is absolutely not so. A muscle car has a specific definition. And I will say that the real muscle cars probably died out with the Buick Grand National in, I think, 1987 or something. Then they had a period of lull where the Ford Mustang was there was not a Camaro for a while, and it all ended up coming back, but it came back in a modern form. And I could do a podcast later on in the future about modern muscle cars, but I'm talking about muscle cars of old here. Germans did not produce cars of an AMG nature during the 60s and the 70s, during the heyday of the muscle car era. Heck, I don't even think they produced them into much of the 80s, maybe the late 80s. BMW did not make cars of an M nature in the 60s and the 70s. Audi did not make cars of an S nature in the 60s or the 70s. Granted, there were other car companies that made high-performance cars, but these were not muscle cars. There is a lot of consideration to be, put into the definition of what a muscle car is. Even though a Corvette is a front-engined, used to be a front-engine, rear-wheel drive American coupe. It's not a muscle car. It's a sports car. And there's a reason why. Corvettes have good handling. Corvettes are balanced. Corvettes are not built on a full-size platform. Those are all things that a muscle car sort of has to be. A muscle car has to be big. A muscle car has to be loud. A muscle car has to have I hate to say it, has to have poor handling and has to have an insane amount of power for what it is. And a Corvette is not that thing. A Corvette is meant to be a sports car. A muscle car was never meant to have that sort of power when they were designing the platform. There's no such thing as a muscle car of old that was designed from the ground up to be a muscle car. No. They took an existing body shell, an existing body platform that had already existed, and beefed it up to become a muscle car. It's a question of intent. They intended to do that. But there was not a muscle car that was designed from the ground up, completely from scratch, just meant to be a muscle car. Not to say that pony cars weren't that way. As you find that the Ford Mustang, a pony car, was designed from the ground up. It was a revolutionary sort of thing that ushered in a whole new era of cars. But when I mentioned Ford Galaxie 500, what was the Ford Galaxie 500? Ford Galaxie 500 was a full-size sedan that they shortened into a coupe and then shoehorned a massive engine into it. Boom, muscle car. Chevy Impala SS. What was it? A regular Chevy Impala that they shortened it to a coupe, boom, threw a giant engine into it, muscle car. Plymouth Roadrunner, what was it? It was a full-size sedan based on some other Chrysler products at the time that they took a giant engine, shoved it under the hood, boom, muscle car. Pontiac GTO was a Pontiac Le Mans. Pontiac Tempest, sorry. What did they do? They put a giant engine into it, boom, muscle car. These were all cars that had already existed. It was meant to be cheap. It was meant to be powerful. It was meant to be fun. And it was meant to be unrefined. Muscle cars weren't terribly expensive like sports cars were. Muscle cars were like we're a different sort of car, but it's for the people who didn't want to break the bank and who wanted a fun and fast car that they could take to the drag strip every once in a while, but that was still civilized enough to drive on regular roads. These AMG cars that people are defending, these M cars, these S types, these S models from Audi, and these R's from Jaguar and whatnot, whatever the racing trims of the European cars are, those cars were designed from the ground up to be that way. They were designed from the ground up to be that way. They were all designed to be performance-oriented. Even in their regular sedan form, they were more performance-oriented than your American sedan. It's not a question of, oh, well, they have big power. No. Big power doesn't make a muscle car. The fact that it's American, the fact that it's unrefined, the fact that it meets these certain criteria, that's what makes it a muscle car. But anyway, in the next segment, you will hear some of people's gripes about the definition of a muscle car. And these are real comments that people made on my Facebook post. Of course, I'm going to keep their names anonymous, but I will tell you what they said, and I think you all will find it interesting.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Alrighty, welcome back, folks. So, this is segment 2. In the first segment, we talked about the actual definition of what a muscle car is, and you began to hear some of my own personal thoughts. Now, in this section, or in this segment, I should say, we are going to be discussing people's gripes about the definition of what a muscle car is. So, as you all know, I made that post. Well, I got a lot of disgruntled comments. I got a lot of comments, mainly from the European members of the group. America doesn't only make this. America is not the only country that makes certain things. America's not the only country. They were talking about as if though I was some sort of egocentric, maniacally patriotic American over here just because I'm keeping to a historical definition of what a car is. I'm not that way. As you all know, if you all don't know a little bit about me, I'm not particularly patriotic. I was born in New Jersey, grew up in Florida, but I am the product of Haitian immigrants. I love the British royal family. I consider myself Northern by birth, Southern by choice, British at heart, Haitian by blood, and Japanese by calling. So that's a whole thing I could unpack in another Get to Know Me podcast or whatever. But just to put it out there, I am not your egocentric, classic, gun-wielding, America American. No, I'm not like that. I consider myself a very worldly, very cultured sort of person, which is why I care so much about history and actual definitions. A definition of a muscle car is the fact that it has to be American. Above all else, it has to be American. And even not all American cars are muscle cars. A Mercury Marauder, man, that thing's fast, but it's not a muscle car. If it were a two-door coupe, it would have qualified as a muscle car, but it's not a muscle car in its four-door sedan form. Dodge Chargers of old were muscle cars, but Dodge Chargers of today, they're four-door sedans. They are not muscle cars. My Buick Park Avenue Ultra has a supercharged engine and is a high-performance version of a lesser model, but it's front-wheel drive. It's a four-door sedan. It's a luxury sedan that has a bit of extra kick goodness, but it is not a muscle car. So all I'm trying to say is that these people were kind of disgruntled about this. People's definitions of what a muscle car were very broad and non-specific. They didn't have a sort of real definition. To them, if I consider it a muscle car, it's a muscle car. No, man, that's not how that works. That's not how that works. If I consider something one thing, but that's actually not what it is, no matter how much I fight for it, no matter how much I feel that it should be considered, no, that's not it. That's simply not the case. Many people ridiculed my opinion by acting that Americans don't make everything, even though a muscle car is literally an American thing. Here's what some people said. One guy cited the 1977 Aston Martin V8 Vantage. Okay, this man had a pretty good case going on. Thing looked like what you would consider a classic muscle car. However, Aston Martins have always been known to be British Grand Touring luxury cars. What is a Grand Tourer, you may ask? Commonly referred to as a GT car. A GT car is a coupe. It's basically a personal luxury car with high performance. So think of your Lexus LC. Think of your Mercedes-Benz S-Class coupe. Think of your BMW 8 Series. Think of your Audi your Audi 6 Series. Those are all grand touring cars. Think of if you were gonna really be, really expensive here. Think of your Bentley Continental. Think of your Rolls-Royce Wraith. Those are grand touring cars of some level or another. Personal luxury cars that offer large performance. They offer high performance, I should say, not large performance. That sounds odd. Those are cars that are considered GT cars. None of those cars would be considered muscle cars. So therefore, an Aston Martin V8 Vantage, even though it has pony car styling, does not qualify as a muscle car. And on top of that, it's not American. It's not American. In order for a muscle car to fit the definition, it must be American. And you will find that I have one exception. I have one exception that you will hear towards the end of the podcast. Stay tuned for hearing that. And the people who made this exception made a pretty good point about it, and to the point that I couldn't argue with them. So, a car like the Aston Martin V8 Vantage has pony car styling and a large engine, but it's British. more considered a luxury GT car. Astons are very refined. That's exactly what I read in my notes. That's exactly what I wrote in my notes, I should say, and I just read it. Astons are very refined cars, given to handling, given to other sorts of things of that nature. Not just shoehorning a large displacement engine into a full-size chassis. That's not the only thing. Or that is the only thing that makes a muscle car, really, and the fact that it's American. Astons are not like that. And you will find that the Aston Martin Vantage of today is a far cry from the Aston Martin Vantage of 77 that had the pony car styling, that looked like a British Mustang. One guy cited the Nissan Skyline C110, the Ken and Mary or Ken Mary. Once again, this was really interesting because I had never known that the C110, the C110, fiddlesticks. I was going to say the C110 generation of the Nissan Skyline was even called the Ken and Mary. But what was more interesting was the fact that he referred to a Japanese car as a muscle car. I've been to Japan. I've done tons of research on Japanese cars. I know people who own Japanese cars because I know people who are in the car scene that have imported them, and I know people in Japan who own cars. The Japanese car, the Nissan Skyline C110, once again, pony car styling, but it is not a muscle car. Now, this is something that you will find interesting. A lot of times, especially older Japanese cars, did not produce a lot of power. Because there's something you should know about Japan driving culture. People in Japan don't drive fast. So if you have a sports car in Japan, unless you're living in a place that has a clear car scene, like I think down in Yokohama or something, driving a muscle car or driving any sort of car that's high performance is really a waste. So as a result, even the really well-known Japanese sports cars never really made that much power. Like, let me just look this up real quick, but I don't think this thing made more than 100 horsepower back in the day. Nissan Skyline C110. I mean, even the R34 didn't make that much power. I think it was like 276 from the factory, and that was in the 90s. So let me look this up real quick. I did not think I was going to end up doing this in the middle of a podcast, but okay. So let's see. This Nissan C110, this Nissan Skyline C110 was produced from 1972 to 1977. And it had a 1.6 liter I4 all the way up to a 2.4 liter I6 engine. So it was either a 4-cylinder or a 6-cylinder model. This thing did not make much power all from what I'm seeing right here. It didn't even make much power. But I need to find the horsepower number just so I can disprove this man. Because this thing, even though it had a GTR trim to it, doesn't mean it was a muscle car. Of all things, this is a sports car, which a sports car is a much different thing from a muscle car. But I finally found the horsepower numbers. The lowest engine had 99 horsepower. The next engine had the 104 horsepower i4. Then you had the 2000 GT that had a 113 horsepower i6. And then a 118 horsepower i6. 2000 GTX had 123 horsepower and with high octane gasoline produced 128 horsepower. 2000 GTE/GTXE had a 128 horsepower engine. The GTR, which was the most powerful, had a 153 horsepower engine. So we're talking about 153 horsepower in a small little Japanese Nissan Skyline, and that was only the GTR version of this Skyline. We're talking about an anemic engine for a tiny little car. Granted, The car is small. It doesn't need that much power to propel it and make it feel fun and sporty. But this thing is closer to a modern day Mazda Miata than it is to a modern day Dodge Challenger Hellcat, which is a real muscle car. So, like, what is this man's point? Because it has the pony car styling doesn't mean it's a muscle car. This thing is a bona fide, tried and true sports car. Small, lightweight, powerful engine relative to body size, and good in handling, and good in matters of sport. Take this thing to the drag strip, this thing will absolutely flounder. No doubt about it. But take it around the twisty roads of the mountain roads in Japan, and this thing will shine. The reason why is because it's not a muscle car. It is a Japanese sports car that happens to have pony car styling. I will say, even though Americans are the only ones that make muscle cars, they are not the only ones that make pony cars. Because a pony car is not just a class of vehicle, a pony car is a body style. In which if you told me that the Nissan Skyline C110 Ken and Mary, as it's referred to as by enthusiasts, was a pony car, I would agree with you 100%. Now, one guy tried to get all intellectual. He said a muscle car was a formula, not an American-only fashion, which I began to follow him on this. But then he said rear-wheel drive coupe GT cars with V8s up front. But a GT is a different car than a muscle car. A muscle car is not a Grand Touring car. So the fact that he's using Grand Touring cars to make his definition of muscle car is already false. Because it is a GT car. It's like I'm saying, well, a station wagon it's like I'm saying, a sedan is more of a formula than it is a specific fashion of car. For example, the Buick Roadmaster Estate wagon was a sedan, but no. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. A sedan is a clearly defined car. It has a rigid definition. I cannot consider a station wagon a sedan. It is not a sedan. It is a station wagon. For example, a GT car is a clearly defined definition. I cannot say a GT car is a muscle car. No. A GT car is a GT car. A muscle car is a muscle car. So GT cars are not muscle cars. He went on to say BMW E31s, BMW E64s, Aston Martin V8 Vantages, a lot of Jaguars, all were muscle cars. And I was like, no. All are GT cars, not muscle cars. Why? They are too refined, and they are not brawny enough, and most of all, they're not American. It has to be American. It has to be American, not by my own definition, but by the definition of Merriam-Webster, by the definition of anybody who is educated in car history. A muscle car is an American car built on a full-size platform, if not full-size, mid-size platform that has a large displacement V8 engine, or not necessarily V8 engine, but most had V8 engines, that was designed to be optimized at drag racing. That's what a muscle car is, in which you find that the only true muscle cars left, true in every sense of the term, probably the Dodge Challenger that is made today, especially the Hellcat. That is a real muscle car. All the other ones, however, more qualify as pony cars and are really getting to the point where they're becoming sports cars, not even so much muscle cars anymore. Because muscle cars did not care about handling. The only exception I would make to this would be the Australian muscle cars. Because if you don't know, the Australian cars are all made by American companies. Though they are built in Australia, they are American cars. Or more accurately, they are Australian cars of an American heritage. So the Ford Falcons down in Australia, I would say, are muscle cars because they have American heritage. For example, I am not a Haitian citizen, but I have Haitian heritage. I was born in the United States. These cars were born in Australia, but had American heritage by virtue that they are made by an American company. Ford and GM makes some Holden Commodores that back in the day would have been considered muscle cars too. So if you tell me that an Australian Ford Falcon is a muscle car, I will agree with you. Because many people said that. And I will say, after my research, yes, Australian cars do count as muscle cars. But moving on to the next segment, we have segment 3, which is a brief history of the muscle car. So please stay tuned after the break, and I will give you a short history on what is considered a muscle car. So please stay tuned and enjoy the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, welcome back, car folks. So, a brief history of muscle cars. Muscle cars had their roots in the 1950s and even as early as the late 1940s. Though muscle cars are commonly considered to be the Pontiac, though the first muscle car is commonly considered to be the Pontiac GTO of the 1960s, some sources say that the 1949 Oldsmobile Rocket 88 was the first muscle car by virtue of it having a powerful V8 high displacement engine put into a smaller lightweight car. That was a muscle car. Still a full-size car, but smaller than the regular full-size car that came from Oldsmobile at the time, which I believe would have been the 98. This was an 88. So in the last segment, that was just a brief introduction to what this segment is going to be. In the last segment, we discussed some of the comments that I had gotten on that Facebook post and how I went through and basically debunked all of them, why those cars weren't considered muscle cars. And in the first segment, we discussed the real definition of what a muscle car is. So in this segment, we're going to be discussing the history of the muscle car. So drag racing influences came into muscle car world in the 1960s, primarily in the 1960s. This prompted many cars that were light to be fitted with powerful engines and modified for the drag strip. One of the ones that immediately comes to mind was the Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt. It was one of those drag strip legends. That was a muscle car. Because what they did, they took a Ford Fairlane and heavily modified it, put a giant engine in the front, replaced some of the body panels with fiberglass, and put drag tires on this thing to the point where it was not even practical to drive on the road anymore. That was a muscle car. Of course, it was not your regular everyday muscle car, but it was still a muscle car. That sort of formula, taking a large engine and putting it into a car that has no business having such a large engine, and then putting it to the drag strip. That is the truest, purest definition of what a muscle car is. There could be cars with muscle. There can be modern muscle cars, but these are not muscle cars. The definition has remained the same, and everything else that's trying to imitate it is just merely drawing inspiration from the muscle car era, but it is not a muscle car. 1964 to 1970 was considered the peak muscle car era. Some cars featured from this period were the Pontiac GTO, the Chevy Chevelle SS, the Plymouth Barracuda. These were all muscle cars. Now, granted, you will find that the Plymouth Barracuda was not a full-size platform that they put an engine into it. It was a mid-size platform that they put an engine into it. But, give or take, it was a muscle car. There is some wiggle room in the definition. But as you can see, all of these cars are American. Moving on. The oil crisis of 1973 would start the decline of the segment. As you all know, and I haven't mentioned this in a podcast in a while, but the oil crisis of 1973 was basically due to, I believe, the Arab oil embargo. Because as you know, a lot of the oil that we get here in America comes from Middle Eastern countries that are, that are Arabian countries, or not Arabian countries, but that are culturally Arab countries. So they called it the Arab oil embargo. There was something going on in the Middle East. They didn't want to import oil to America or export it to America, so they placed an embargo on the trade of oil, and it caused a crisis. This had an everlasting impact on American car culture across the board. American cars at this time period, late 60s, early 70s, were getting like 10 miles per gallon if you had a full-size luxury sedan like a Cadillac Fleetwood or something. These things were getting 10 miles per gallon. They were not efficient in any way, shape, or form. Well, the oil crisis prompted the end of the muscle car era. It prompted the beginning of the end for the traditional American luxury sedan. It prompted the beginning of the end for large, inefficient cars in America, regardless of their body style. Be it they be station wagons, be it they be full-size luxury sedans, or be it they be muscle cars. All of these cars were large and inefficient. And not only that, but it gave rise to the German and Japanese companies that would eventually dominate the American market for them to make room to come on in. Because these cars came from places where gas has always been more expensive, and therefore they were tuned to be more efficient. And not only that, but they were also better engineered than American cars. So they came, and I know where I'm going with this. They came here to America and took away a lot of the sales of American cars, because the oil crisis had the American car companies scrambling to try to beat out the Germans, to try to beat out the Japanese, to the point where you got cars like the Cadillac Seville aimed at the Germans, but you had cars eventually down the line like the Chevy Cavalier that was aimed at, not even the Chevy Cavalier, Chevy Vega, that was aimed at some of the import cars, because these cars were small and they were supposed to be fuel efficient economy sort of cars. And these cars ended up splitting and going the way of either trying to tackle German luxury or trying to tackle efficient Japanese imports. Where did the muscle car go in this? Muscle car almost disappeared for a while. Not to say there weren't large high-performance coupes anymore, but the muscle car began to downsize. The muscle car began to, sort of lose itself for a bit, until they could find how to make these cars larger and powerful while still remaining efficient to meet with the new demands for gas, or the new demands for cars that use less gas. There was a time there was not really muscle cars. I mean, this was a time that kind of came about probably late 70s into the 80s. There were cars like the Camaro that trudged along for a few more years, but eventually the Camaro was discontinued. The Dodge Charger was discontinued. AMC Javelin discontinued. AMC Rebel discontinued. All of those great old muscle cars from old discontinued. Never to see the light of day again for some of them. Plymouth Barracuda. I think the Plymouth Barracuda had already been dead by this point. But if not, it had been discontinued too because it didn't survive into the modern age. And the car that kept on soldiering on was the Ford Mustang. But like I said, the Ford Mustang had always been a pony car. Always smaller than the muscle car. But it was in purely by my conjecture alone. Not that I did research on this specific topic. But I feel like it was in this time that the pony cars became the new muscle cars. Here's why I say that. The pony cars had always been more efficient than their muscle car counterparts. Their muscle car bigger brothers, if I could put it that way. Always been more efficient. Always been more refined, if you will, when it came to performance. Now that the muscle cars were going the way of the dodo, people still wanted their high-performance cars. So they would tune pony cars like the Mustang, put bigger engines in them, and then market them as muscle cars during this time period that there was not really a muscle car from like the mid to late 70s to the mid to late 80s for about 10 years there. So you will find that the Camaro didn't make it. The other cars didn't make it, but the Ford Mustang continued, and the Ford Mustang transformed. From the 70s Mustang II, that was not a muscle car by any stretch of the imagination, but still a pony car, to the 80s Mustang 5.0 that the Fox body platform was made famous by. This is how the Mustang transformed from a pony car into the muscle car, because cars like the Ford Galaxy 500, also made by Ford obviously, couldn't continue because their definition was just too rigid. There was not much room for evolution. They had to just go away and be reborn years later. So when you have that sort of transformation, that's why pony cars and muscle cars today are often confused because of this time period where Americans obviously still wanted high-performance coupes, but they couldn't have them because of the oil embargo and the oil crisis because those things were too inefficient. Then they had sort of a transformation of the pony car into a muscle car. So when all the pony cars began to come back, late 90s, early 2000s, as retro models, they had a muscle and they were built to look like the pony cars of old. But because the American muscle cars, the true muscle cars, were all dead, the pony cars became the muscle cars. And by all definition today, these things would still be considered muscle cars, because they are modern muscle cars. They are not the muscle cars of old, like the Pontiac GTO, like the Chevy Impala SS, like the Ford Galaxy 500, that were muscle cars. So this is how I believe the shift ended up happening, which is a giant sort of shift in muscle car history. It's like muscle cars dead, so therefore pony cars must move up to fill the shoes of muscle cars. The only muscle car I'm losing the words here. I can definitely say was a true muscle car in the 80s was the Buick Grand National, or the Buick GNX. That was a real muscle car because it took the mid-size Regal platform, which all intents and purposes was a full-size car by today's standards. Took the mid-size Regal platform, slapped a turbo on the V6 that was already in it, and then tuned it for the drag strip and called it a day. That was the Buick Grand National. That was the Buick GNX. That was not a pony car that transformed into muscle car territory. That was a bona fide muscle car. No, it did not have a V8, but muscle cars don't necessarily need to have a V8. And plus, remember, fuel economy was still a thing that people were struggling with in the 1980s. But if you told me what was the last true muscle car using the same formula as the formula of old, it was the 1987 Buick GSMC. That was the last muscle car. During the time where muscle cars were dying, GM decided to do something great and bring it back. That was the last true muscle car. So there you have it. That's the history of the muscle car. I purposely left out the modern muscle cars because that's a different class of vehicles in itself. That I told you how they came about. They came about for a necessity of high-performance cars. So they took the pony cars and made them into muscle cars, but that's not what they were originally meant for. So please stay tuned for segment 4, in which I give you my own personal definition of what a muscle car is and all the other things I think about muscle cars. So please stay tuned.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
All right, folks. So, welcome to segment 4. As you all know, traditionally, segment 4 is my opinion piece. So, you've heard about the actual definition of what a muscle car is. You've heard about some of the things that people said to try to defend the fact that a muscle car didn't necessarily have to be American, and why I debunked all of those. And you've heard the brief history of a muscle car, and plus even a tad bit into how pony cars became muscle cars. How they grew up and became muscle cars when muscle cars, there was a lack of muscle cars due to the oil crisis of the 1970s. Now, here's my own definition of a muscle car. My muscle car definition would be a car made after the Plymouth Barracuda, but before the Buick GSMC. That was a large displacement, high output engine put into a smaller car for the sole purpose of making as much power and as much speed in a straight line as possible without much thought given to handling. So it would have to come after the Barracuda and before the GSMC. So about 1962 to 1987. Any car built in that time period that was American, that had that formula, would have been considered a muscle car in my definition. Why American? The reason why I believe a muscle car should be American is because I'm what you call a purist. Not only am I what you call a purist, but I also believe to sticking to the rules and looking at history and saying what is historically accurate. Cars, just like anything, have a history. And the history of the car is something that I considered myself to be very well versed in. Hence why I'm doing a car podcast. The history of the muscle car dictates that it is an American idea. And the definition of the American or the muscle car dictates that it must be American. I'm not saying this as a staunch American who believes that Americans are the best country on earth. Frankly, I don't believe America is the best country on earth. I don't believe that there can be considered a best country on earth. But I will tell you that muscle cars are undoubtedly American, just like hamburgers are American. Hamburgers are American. Heck, hot dogs came from Germany. Apple pie came from the Dutch. A lot of pizza was Italian. But hamburgers are purely American, just like muscle cars. The idea of the muscle car was conceptualized here in America. There is not another sort of car company out there that can lay a claim to producing a muscle car if it's not American, save for the American cars in Australia that are also muscle cars. This is why I find it difficult to deal with some of the comments that I made on the Facebook post. I know that it was going to disgruntle feathers, but it's the fact that a lot of them were just inaccurate. Some man tried to pass off a VR6 R34, a VR6 Golf R34, like a Volkswagen Golf, like the hatchback, as a muscle car. I'm like, bruh, are you serious? That's not a muscle car. It's a hot hatch. Americans make hot hatches too. But that's not a muscle car. Just because it has a large engine and it's high performance doesn't mean it's a muscle car. No, a muscle car is a specific sort of thing. And I find that American cars are the ones that have that sort of brawn, that have that sort of blatant disregard for propriety, that everybody finds so glorious about the muscle cars. European cars are much too refined. Japanese cars are much too reserved to be considered muscle cars. A muscle car is a capture of the American spirit, in a sense. A muscle car is a product of the American culture. It's large, it's loud, it's brawny, and it doesn't care what people think. That's who Americans are. Whether you like it or not, we are loud people, we are proud people, and we don't care, we don't give a flying flop about what anybody else around the world thinks of us. Because we are the best, we are the biggest, we are the most powerful. That's every single stereotype of America in car form, manifested in car form. That's why a muscle car has to be American. The other car companies, the other car producing countries around the world don't produce anything like that. You find that Japanese culture is very reserved. Japanese people are very quiet and very humble. Their cars, at least the ones that they produce for the Japanese market, by and large are like that. Even their sports cars, like the legendary Nissan Skylines, especially the R34 that everybody loves so much, they had a gentleman's agreement to not rate the horsepower as being any higher than 276 horsepower, because anything else would be too excessive. And then some man tried to tell me that a Nissan Skyline was a muscle car. If a Nissan Skyline was truly a muscle car, a Nissan Skyline would not only be American, but it would also have a blatant disregard for any sorts of gentleman's agreement about how they were going to rate the horsepower, and they were going to try to be as crazy as possible and stuff as much power as possible without breaking anything into the car for it to be a muscle car and make it into some sort of drag strip monster or some street racing legend. That's a muscle car. A muscle car has to be American. Only Americans are crazy enough to do something like that. The Germans are all about engineering. They're very precise. Muscle cars are imprecise. Have you seen those 70s movies in which they're driving the muscle cars getting away from the cops? Goodness, you notice that they keep on turning the steering wheel. Man, you actually had to do that, because if you didn't keep on turning the steering wheel, you never knew where your wheels were because the handling was that bad. That's a muscle car. That's the muscle car. The Japanese cars are too reserved. The German cars are too engineered or too precise. A muscle car has to be imprecise. A muscle car has to be loud. A muscle car has to be, crazy and brawny and too much power. And I don't care what anybody thinks. It screams that I don't give a crap. That's what a muscle car is. And I think we're doing a disservice to the muscle car by saying, oh, well, other companies produce muscle cars, other countries produce muscle cars. No, they don't. You're doing a disservice to the muscle car. Heck, Americans don't even really produce muscle cars anymore, save for Chrysler, which, man, if there's ever a time I'm going to praise Chrysler is by keeping the muscle car alive. Because even the Mustang now, even though it's a modern muscle car, but the Mustang has become much more of a sports car than anything else. The Camaro has become much more of a sports car than anything else, especially now that Corvette is a mid-engine car. Where are people going to look for when they want a high-performance, rear-wheel drive V8 car? They're not going to look towards the Corvette anymore because it's not front-engine, rear-wheel drive. The Corvette has transcended that. Now they're going to start looking for the Camaro. So the Camaros are going to become Chevy's new Corvette, thus becoming more and more sport-oriented, worrying about tuning the suspension, worrying about cornering, worrying about handling so much. That's not even a muscle car at that point. It's too refined. We are doing a disservice to the great muscle cars of old by just thinking anybody can be lumped in with the muscle cars. It's like, I don't mean to get religious, but I want to think of it this way. It's like Jesus and the 12 disciples. Man, in order for you to be considered an apostle, you have to actually know Jesus, the bodily Jesus, the historical Jesus, the God in human flesh. You have to actually know him. Not just anybody who believes in Jesus is an apostle. It's the same way with the muscle car. Not just any performance car with rear-wheel drive and a front-engine V8 is a muscle car. Nah, it's much more special than that. There will never be another true muscle car. Just like there will never be another true apostle. They had to know Jesus. You had to be American. You had to be American. You had to actually, have that American formula to be a muscle car. And they don't cut it if they're not American. It has to be American. It's an American cultural sort of thing. It's a part of American culture. It's a matter of history. It's not because I don't like other countries or I don't believe that they can make powerful cars or I don't believe they can make good cars. Those cars are different. They're not the same. Frankly, they're probably better than muscle cars, if I'm going to be completely honest. I'd rather have a Mercedes AMG car than a Dodge Challenger Hellcat. But this is what we have. It is a muscle car. So that's basically what I have to say about that. I've ranted about muscle cars, and I've ranted about why I think a muscle car must be American, why the definition says so, the history of muscle cars, all sorts of that other stuff. So I thank you all for listening this far into the podcast, if you made it to the end. And like I said, I am a lover of all cars. I'm not trying to poo-poo anybody, but if we're going to talk about cars, we have to talk about them accurately. So thank you so much for listening to this edition of the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the social media. Leave us a like, leave us a comment. Those things really help us. And please continue enjoying cars and stay tuned for next time. Have a good night, folks.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.